You know, there's something deeply unsettling about a president having to give himself a pep talk on live television. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a Netflix documentary about a failed startup, not the diplomatic reception room of the White House. But here we are in December 2025, and that's exactly what happened when Donald Trump decided he needed to address the nation about the economy. And let me just say, when your own approval rating on the economy is 36%, scheduling a primetime speech to tell everyone how great you're doing is like organizing a surprise party for yourself and being genuinely shocked when nobody shows up. Now, if you missed Trump's December 17th address, and honestly, I don't blame you because there was probably something better on Netflix, let me catch you up. Trump stood in the diplomatic reception room for nearly 20 minutes, speaking loudly. And when I say loudly, I mean at the volume of someone trying to explain cryptocurrency to their grandmother, to defend his economic record. And the central message was essentially, everything is great, prices are down, wages are up, and if you think otherwise, you're wrong. But here's the thing that's both fascinating and deeply concerning about this speech. It wasn't just wrong, it was wrong in very specific, measurable ways. According to recent polls, about 70% of Americans say things have become too unaffordable. Unemployment has risen to 4.6%, higher than when he took office. And inflation is sitting at 3%, exactly where it was when he started his second term. So when Trump declared inflation is stopped, it was like standing in the rain and declaring the weather is perfect. And look, I get it. Nobody wants to admit they're struggling. If I had approval ratings in the 30s, I'd probably also want to give a speech explaining why everyone else is wrong about my performance. But the difference is I'm not the president, and my job doesn't involve managing the world's largest economy. My job involves making jokes about people who do that badly, which frankly has never been easier. Think about it this way. Imagine if your doctor told you that your fever had broken while you were actively sweating and shivering in front of them. You'd probably want a second opinion. But when the president does essentially the same thing with economic data, we're supposed to just nod along politely. It's like being in a relationship where your partner insists everything is fine while simultaneously packing their bags and calling a divorce attorney. But what made this speech truly remarkable wasn't just the disconnect from reality, though that was substantial. It was the way Trump's own administration seemed to contradict him in real time. Take his claim that he's secured a record-breaking $18 trillion of investment into the United States. That's a staggering number. It's also completely fictional. Even Trump's own White House website said the figure was $9.6 trillion, and that number is itself a massive exaggeration. According to CNN's detailed analysis, the White House was counting vague investment pledges and statements that didn't even rise to the level of actual commitments. It's like claiming you've raised $1 million for charity because a bunch of people said, "Yeah, that sounds nice," when you mentioned it at a dinner party. And this brings me to perhaps the most surreal part of the entire evening, the graphics. Now, you might think I'm about to talk about some minor technical detail, but stay with me because this is where it gets truly absurd. Trump's communications team prepared a slideshow, actual PowerPoint slides, that they sent to major TV networks ahead of time, encouraging them to show the graphics on screen during the speech. It's like if your uncle decided to give a TED talk at Thanksgiving dinner and handed everyone printed charts to follow along. But here's where it gets even better. Most networks said no. NBC, ABC, CBS, and CNN all declined to show Trump's homemade graphics. The reason? The slides didn't come with clear sourcing information, which is journalism speak for, we have no idea where these numbers came from. Only Fox News agreed to display some of the slides, which tells you everything you need to know about both the quality of the graphics and Fox News's editorial standards. Now imagine being a White House communications director and having to explain to your boss that major television networks are treating his PowerPoint presentation like a suspicious email attachment from a Nigerian prince. Well, sir, they said your charts lack basic sourcing and credibility. It's the kind of conversation that would be hilarious if it weren't happening in the actual White House with the actual President of the United States. And the visual of this whole thing is just perfect, isn't it? Trump's team spending hours crafting these graphics, probably having multiple meetings about font choices and color schemes, then sending them out to networks like they're submitting homework, only to have most of them responded to with the professional equivalent of, "Thanks, but no thanks." And this is the part that made me actually laugh out loud, one of Trump's own slides contradicted his talking points. Trump spent part of the speech claiming gas was under $2 in some places, but his own graphic showing national gas prices revealed that the average was still near $3. It's like preparing a presentation about your successful diet while your own before and after photos show you gained weight. At this point, you might be wondering why Trump felt the need to give this speech in the first place. And the answer is pretty straightforward. Because things are not going well. Recent polling shows that Americans are more dissatisfied with his economic performance than ever before. About 2/3 of Americans disapprove of his handling of the economy, an issue that, let's be honest, was supposed to be his strong suit. It's like being a professional chef and having people consistently send back your signature dish. The specific numbers are actually quite sobering when you look at them. According to the latest NPR PBS News Marist poll, 45% of Americans say prices are their top economic concern, more than double any other category. Real average hourly earnings were essentially unchanged in recent months. And perhaps most tellingly, 57% of Americans describe themselves as having a negative view of what's to come in the year ahead. That's a complete reversal from a year ago, when most people felt optimistic about 2025. It's like the entire country collectively realized they'd been watching the wrong movie and the sequel is going to be even worse. But what's particularly striking about these numbers is how consistent they are across different demographics. Both Republicans and independents have become significantly more negative about affordability compared to just 6 months ago. In June, Republicans said their areas were affordable by a 64% to 36% margin. Now they're split 51%, 49%. That's not just a statistical shift. That's a fundamental change in how people experience daily life. When your own supporters start agreeing that things aren't affordable anymore, that's like having your own family vote you out of the fantasy football league. But what makes this situation particularly fascinating is how it reveals the fundamental challenge facing any politician who promises simple solutions to complex problems. During his campaign, Trump pledged to end inflation and make America affordable again on day one. That's a bold promise, and also an impossible one, because inflation isn't a light switch you can flip off. It's more like a massive container ship that takes miles to change course, assuming you know how to steer it in the first place. And this is where we get to the heart of what makes this story so important. Because Trump's response to declining approval ratings wasn't to adjust his policies or acknowledge the challenges people are facing. Instead, he doubled down on claims that contradicted his own government's data. He insisted that everything else is falling rapidly in terms of grocery prices when consumer price index data shows that far more grocery items have increased in price than decreased since he returned to office. It's like insisting the Titanic is unsinkable while standing on the deck as it's actively sinking. The speech also highlighted another concerning trend, the increasing disconnect between political rhetoric and economic reality. When Trump declared that wages are up and prices are down, he wasn't just being optimistic, he was describing a parallel universe where basic economic indicators don't apply. And when a president's version of events is contradicted not just by independent analysts, but by his own administration's data, we've entered territory that should concern anyone who believes in fact-based governance. Now, I should note that Trump did announce one concrete policy during the speech, a $1,176 payment to military service members, which he called a warrior dividend. And setting aside the somewhat on-the-nose patriotic symbolism of that dollar amount, this actually illustrates another problem with the Trump administration's approach to economic policy. These one-time payments might provide temporary relief to specific groups, but they don't address the underlying issues driving inflation and affordability concerns. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken arm and declaring yourself a surgeon. And let's be honest about the timing here. Announcing a military bonus during a speech defending your economic record while your approval ratings are tanking isn't economic policy. It's political theatre with a checkbook. It's the governing equivalent of that friend who always picks up the bar tab right before asking you to help them move. Sure, the gesture is nice, but the underlying motivation is pretty transparent. The $1,176 amount is particularly amusing because it's such obvious symbolism that it almost parodies itself. Did they workshop other patriotic numbers? Was someone in a meeting suggesting $140.90 for Columbus Day, $119.69 for the moon landing? It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder if there's a White House intern whose entire job is finding ways to work historical dates into random policy announcements. And speaking of questionable medical metaphors, Trump also repeated his claim that his executive order on prescription drug prices would cut costs by as much as 400, 500, and even 600%. Now, I'm no mathematician, but cutting something by 500% would mean the drug companies would have to pay you to take the medication, which sounds great in theory, but suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how percentages work. It's like claiming you can lose 150% of your body weight without disappearing entirely. But perhaps the most telling moment of the entire speech came when Trump blamed his predecessor for current economic problems while simultaneously claiming credit for any positive trends. This is a classic political move, but it becomes particularly absurd when you're nearly a full year into your second term. It's like taking over as coach of a sports team, playing an entire season, and then blaming the previous coach when your team loses. At some point, you have to own your record. And Trump's record, at least according to his own government's data, is mixed at best. The unemployment rate is higher now than when he took office. Inflation remains stuck at the same level it was in January. Housing costs continue to strain family budgets. And perhaps most importantly, Americans consistently report feeling worse about the economy than the official statistics suggest they should. That disconnect between data and lived experience is crucial, because ultimately, economics isn't just about numbers. It's about how people feel about their financial security. This brings us to a broader question about presidential communication in the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles. When Franklin Roosevelt gave his fireside chats, he was speaking to a nation that largely shared the same information sources. When Trump gives a primetime address in 2025, he's speaking to an audience that gets information from dozens of different sources, many of which fact-check his statements in real time. The old model of presidential communication, where the president could shape public perception simply by speaking authoritatively, has given way to something more complex and contentious. And yet Trump's approach to this new reality has been to simply talk louder and make bolder claims. During the December 17th speech, he didn't just defend his record, he shouted about it, literally. The entire address had what reporters described as the feel of a Trump rally speech without the rally. It was performative in a way that felt both desperate and oddly disconnected from the formal setting of a presidential address. This performance aspect is worth examining more closely because it reveals something important about how Trump understands his role as president. Rather than seeing himself as a public servant accountable to data and democratic norms, he often acts like an entertainer whose primary job is to maintain audience enthusiasm. The problem is that economic reality doesn't care about your approval ratings, and inflation doesn't respond to loud speeches or optimistic graphics. The international implications of this approach are also worth considering. When the President of the United States gives a speech that's immediately fact-checked and found to contain multiple false claims about basic economic indicators, it sends a message to allies and competitors alike about the reliability of American leadership. It's hard to maintain credibility in international economic negotiations when your own statements about domestic economic performance are contradicted by your own government's data. Imagine being a foreign finance minister trying to negotiate a trade deal with the United States when the American president's own economic claims don't match his own administration's numbers. It's like trying to buy a car from a salesman who insists it's red while you're both looking at a blue vehicle. At some point, you start to wonder if you're speaking the same language or if the person you're negotiating with has a fundamentally different relationship with observable reality. And this credibility gap has real consequences beyond just embarrassing headlines. International markets depend on reliable information from major economies to make investment decisions. When American economic data becomes politically negotiable rather than factually grounded, it introduces uncertainty that can actually affect global financial stability. It's one thing to have policy disagreements with other countries. It's another thing entirely to have them question whether your basic economic statistics are trustworthy. And this credibility gap extends beyond foreign policy. When business leaders, investors, and ordinary Americans can't trust basic economic statements from the president, it creates uncertainty that can actually harm economic performance. Markets rely on accurate information to function efficiently, and when political leaders consistently provide inaccurate information, it can distort decision-making across the entire economy. But perhaps most importantly, this episode reveals the ongoing tension between democratic accountability and populist messaging. Trump's December 17th speech wasn't really aimed at convincing experts or economists. It was designed to shore up support among his base by providing them with talking points that sound good regardless of their accuracy. The problem is that governing requires more than just messaging. It requires policies that actually work in the real world, with real people dealing with real economic challenges. And those challenges are significant. Despite Trump's claims that everything is improving, millions of Americans are struggling with housing costs, grocery prices, and healthcare expenses that continue to strain family budgets. These aren't abstract policy debates. They're daily realities for working families across the country. And when political leaders respond to these challenges with speeches that deny their existence, it creates a dangerous disconnect between governance and the actual needs of the people being governed. So where does this leave us? Well, we have a president whose economic approval rating is at historic lows, who responds to criticism by giving speeches that contradict his own government's data and whose proposed solutions largely consist of one-time payments and vague promises about future improvements. It's like being told the ship is sailing smoothly while water is clearly visible on the deck. And the truly concerning part isn't just that the economics are problematic, it's that the response to economic problems has become purely rhetorical rather than substantive. When faced with polling that shows Americans are struggling with affordability, Trump's approach was to give a loud speech insisting that affordability isn't actually a problem. It's like responding to a fire alarm by unplugging the alarm rather than addressing the fire. But here's what I find genuinely troubling about all of this. We're not just talking about bad economic policy or ineffective communication. We're talking about a fundamental erosion of the idea that political leaders should be accountable to factual reality. When a president can give a nationally televised speech containing multiple, demonstrably false claims about basic economic indicators, and when that speech is seen primarily through the lens of political messaging rather than policy substance, we've crossed into territory that should concern anyone who believes in evidence-based governance, because ultimately, economics isn't a matter of opinion. Inflation rates, unemployment figures, and wage growth are measurable phenomena with real impacts on real people's lives. And when political leaders treat these measurements as optional or negotiable, they're not just misleading the public, they're undermining the entire foundation of democratic accountability. And that, more than any specific policy disagreement or approval rating, is what makes Trump's December 17th speech genuinely significant. It wasn't just a political miscalculation or a communications failure. It was a demonstration of how far we've drifted from the basic expectation that public officials should provide accurate information about the issues they're responsible for managing. So the next time you hear a politician give a speech about how great everything is, while their own data suggests otherwise, remember this moment. Remember that presidential speeches used to be events where the country's leader provided accurate information and thoughtful analysis of complex challenges. And remember that we don't have to accept a world where basic economic facts are treated as partisan talking points rather than shared starting points for serious policy discussions. Think about how surreal it is that we now live in an era where major television networks have to fact-check the president's graphics in real time, and where the most newsworthy part of a presidential economic address might be that his own slides contradicted his talking points. This isn't normal, and we shouldn't treat it as normal just because we've gotten used to it. Because at the end of the day, the economy is too important to be left to speechwriters and graphic designers who can't even get their own numbers straight. And the American people deserve better than leaders who respond to real problems with fictional solutions delivered at rally volume in the diplomatic reception room. They deserve leaders who understand that governing requires engaging with reality as it actually exists, not as they wish it existed or as their political messaging suggests it should exist. We'll see you next time when we'll hopefully be discussing leaders who understand that governing requires more than just talking louder when the facts don't support your arguments.